Can you believe this is a 1-block quilt and uses 5 yards of fabric? Come sew along with me and I'll show you. Hi, it's Fran Morgan with Fabric Café, and today we're going to be making a quilt from our new book, Fabulous 5-Yard Quilts. Working with 5 yards is a little bit different than our normal 3 yards, but we've kept the system super easy for you. Fabric 1 is represented by a little polka dot. Fabric 2 is represented by the white. Fabric 3 by the black. Our fabric 4 acts like another focus, and it is represented by a little check that looks a little bit like a gingham. And then fabric 5, you can choose a light or a dark, and therefore it is represented by a gray. Now let's check out the fabric that we're working with today. So we have our beautiful 5 yards here. Our fabric number 1 is our focus fabric, and you can see we have this really fun floral print, and I love it. It's on black with all these great bold colors. Then our number 2 is a white with a little, what looks like a cross stitch on it, which I kind of like. It kind of adds a little charm. As you can see that from the 2 and the 3, it is the lightest after you remove the focus. And then our number 3 is this great pink. It's the darkest. Now we're moving to our fabric 4, which is this great purple. I love it. This acts as our secondary focus, and I really like this purple because it has some great texture and it picks up the floral from our number 1. Now for our fabric 5, remember we can choose light or dark. We've chosen a dark in this case, and it is a beautiful, it kind of reads like gray, but it's kind of a blue and a black together, and it picks up all the dark background in our number 1 fabric, which is gorgeous. Absolutely love these together, and they are going to come together fabulous in the quilt that we're making today. Now this is the Wondrous quilt, and I really like this quilt. There's some really cool things about it. First, let's talk about the design. I love the way the blocks come together and create kind of this flower star, and it creates it in 2 different colorways, which I think is so cool. It kind of comes together and creates this little diamond in the middle, which is really fun, and it does that on both sections. And it's a 1-block quilt, which is amazing. So what we have here is the corner of this here, all the way down to the corner of this here, is the corners of our block. And I think it's so very cool that we can rotate them and put them together. And I love too how it has this secondary pattern in here that creates this diagonal line throughout the quilt pattern. I think it just adds some extra interest and really makes it look like a very challenging quilt when it's not. So let's get sewing. I like to make labels for everything before I start cutting my fabric. I just go down my cutting instructions and make a label for all my assemblies, borders, and binding. I also like to note what fabric position it is. This is especially helpful since we're working with 5 different fabrics this time. Now we're going to cut all our fabrics. For all 5 fabrics, we're going to cut long with the fabric strips and cut squares from those for our different assemblies. I make my first cut a little bit past my selvage end so that I can turn it around and cut the selvage off when I square my block. The squares I'm cutting out will be used for half square triangles and stitch and flip units. I recommend using a square ruler to cut your squares from your long strips. I'm using a 6.5 inch square ruler. Anytime I start a new project, I love to start with a fresh rotary blade. It makes the cutting so much easier and smoother. When cutting my squares, I like to keep my strips folded so that I can get 2 squares at a time. Every time I make a project, I cut my pieces and organize them in plastic baggies with labels. I feel so organized once I start sewing, and it's very satisfying to just grab a bag and go. Sometimes in our patterns, we cut multiple pieces from the same strip. We do this in an effort to use as much fabric as possible. Just take it 1 step at a time. I like to keep all of my leftover fabric after my cutting is done, just in case I make a sewing or discover a cutting mistake later. Last but not least, we're going to cut all of our binding strips. Now it's time to move on to step 1 of our pattern, our half square triangle 1, 2, and 3 assemblies. First, we're going to draw a line on your square from corner to corner. I just used my square ruler to get a nice line. I'm going to put my fabric squares right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch from my drawn line on both sides. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance throughout my quilt. I like to chain piece my half square triangles together. I don't cut my threads between the blocks until I have sewn the other side. This helps the other side go really fast and easy because my squares are already in line. Now we're going to cut on that drawn line, so we'll end up with 2 half square triangles from each square. I really like the slotted trimmer for trimming my half square triangles. I line up the slotted trimmer dotted line on my seam. This lets me trim the excess off the top with only 1 ruler line up. There are little slots on the side of the ruler to trim your dog ears off as well. It really speeds up the trimming process. After we trim our half square triangles, we're going to press them. We suggest pressing your half square triangle seams open. This helps keep it flat and prevents it from getting bulky at the seams when you have a lot of half square triangles joining together. For this pattern, we're going to be making 3 different half square triangles. We will follow the exact same method to mark, sew, trim, and press them. When I'm making half square triangles, I prefer to break up my marking, sewing, trimming, and pressing. This helps keep it fresh and fun. Now we're moving on to Unit A assembly. I like to lay out all of my half square triangles in the arrangement they need to be for the unit. That way I can make sure that everything is turned the correct way. I suggest sewing all of our step 1s for our unit first. Once we've pressed those, we will sew our step 2 pieces together. Now we're ready to sew those pieces. We're going to place those right sides together. I like to put a pin right in the center where the seam matches up so that my pinwheel will come together right in the center. I carefully sew up to the pin, and instead of sewing over it, I pull the pin out. This is very important to me because once I sewed over my pin and broke my needle and it almost hit me in the eye. So be careful. We're going to repeat those steps until we have 24 Unit A's. Our next step is to make 24 Unit B's. These are very similar to our Unit A's, but you can see that our half square triangles are rotated. So make sure you turn them the right direction when you lay them out. Once we have our unit laid out correctly, we're going to follow the same method we used for sewing our Unit A's. We'll sew our step 1s first and press them. Then we'll sew our step 2s and press those. Then we'll take both our step 1 and 2s and sew them together to make our beautiful pinwheel. And there you have it, our Unit B's are done. Now we're moving on to Unit C assemblies. We're going to be doing a simple stitch and flip for this unit. So first, we need to start by marking our fabric 3 corner squares. When we sew these, we're going to line up the square right in the corner of our fabric 1 block with right sides together. Then we're going to sew right on the line we drew, which is different from our half square triangles we made. Now it's time to trim. We're going to trim a 1/4 inch from the seam line. I'm going to lay my 1/4 inch line of my ruler directly onto that seam line, and that will give me a nice straight edge to cut. After you trim all your units, you're going to press your seams open. And that's your Unit C's done. Easy! We're moving on to Unit D assembly. This is our last unit before we make our blocks. We're going to follow the same process we did for our Unit C assembly. I love using the stitch and flip method. Being able to just trim once while you're making the block is a lot faster than making a half square triangle, but you still get this great angle effect. We're going to keep going until we have 24 unit Ds. Now it's time for block assembly. I like to lay out all my units how they need to be sewn to make the block. You'll know it's right because the fabrics from your stitch and flip unit and the pinwheel units will match. I found this really helpful while assembling my blocks. Then we want to get a nice press. Before I sew my block step 2s, I like to just double check that my units are all going the correct direction. There are no seams to match for these first steps, so that's a great time saver. Now that these steps are all sewn and pressed, we're ready to sew them together to make our block. I'll flip one side over the other and pick up the side I'm going to be sewing. I'm just going to use one pin and put it right in the center where those seams match up. And there you go, we have a finished block. We're gonna make 24 blocks for this quilt. Once all our blocks are finished, we're on to the best part, quilt assembly. I put a sticky note on the pattern underneath the row I'm laying out. This helps me keep it all straight. I like to lay out all my blocks before I start sewing them to make sure everything is going the right direction. Then I just move the sticky note down as I lay out the rows. As you are laying out your blocks, it's easy to see if they are right because the fabrics match up to make this fun design. I like to stack my rows up from left to right and take them one at a time to my sewing machine. This row has 4 blocks, so I'm going to sew the first 2 blocks together and then my last 2 blocks. Then we're going to sew both sets to make our row. When our row is complete, we'll press our seams open. That's our first row done. We're going to repeat those steps until we have 6 rows. Now it's time to sew those rows together. I like to sew my rows together in sets of 2. So I'm going to sew together 3 sets of 2 and then sew those together. This helps me cut down on bulk while sewing. I'm going to pin everywhere my seams match up. Make sure you're matching up your colors to make this diamond shape. Whenever you're sewing large chunks of fabric together like this, I like to keep my largest section on the bottom. I find this easier to manage. And now the center of the quilt is finished. Time to add the borders. I sew my border strips end to end by matching up my selvage edges. I sew 1/4 inch from the selvage line. Once my strips are sewn, I will trim the selvage off and press my seams open. I do this for all my borders. This quilt's borders are a little bit different. For our border 1, we're actually going to use 2 different fabrics. We're using fabric 1 on the left and top of the quilt and our fabric 4 on the right and the bottom of the quilt. I like to start a little bit past the top of the quilt so that I can get a nice even trim later. We always start by sewing our side borders on. After we press both side borders, we'll get a more accurate trim with our rotary blade. We alternated our borders like this so that we could use as much of the fabric as possible. I also think it has a nice effect. Now that those are trimmed, we're going to sew our strips onto the top and bottom. The rest of the borders only use one color, so you won't have to worry about alternating. When I got to the edge of one of my borders, I had a seam that was going to fall right on the edge. But if I took that seam out, it would give just enough fabric to trim even after pressing. So I just seam ripped that small section out and then finished sewing the strip on. We're going to rinse and repeat for the third border. And there you go, our finished quilt. Now, I really enjoyed making the Wondrous pattern, and there's a couple of things that I did to help strategize putting this together. First, I broke up all of my half square triangles into smaller piles so that I wasn't sewing them and cutting them all at once. I find that that really helps me put them together and not get tired of trimming. So I love doing that, putting them in stacks of 20 or something like that. It really helps it go a lot faster. Now, another thing that I really liked is that each block has a stitch and flip square with the focus fabric and then our number 4, our secondary focus fabric. Whenever I put the rows together, I knew that all of my focus fabric needed to come together to create this great kind of star flower here. And then all of our number 4 fabrics needed to match and come together to create this little star flower over here. So it was really neat how the quilt kind of helped me make it, which I really liked. It was a lot of fun. Now we're going to get this quilted, send it out to the long arm, but let me get you the kit information for this because it's really sweet. This kit is called Garden Celebrations. It's our Wondrous pattern from our fabulous 5-yard quilt book. Now I have some more fabric inspiration for this pattern because this is a great pattern. Let's look at this. Now this one is done in these gorgeous peaches and greens and white, and I think it just looks so crisp and clean. So we've used our wonderful green floral as our focus and that peach, and the number 4 is our double focus with all the other colors coming in there. I just think this is gorgeous. Now this combination, this kit is called Floral Tango. Now the next one, I love this. It's got that modern twist that's so much fun. Done in these jade greens that I absolutely love. And I like how it's a monochromatic quilt and it really comes together beautifully. Once again, we have that focus number 1 fabric and that number 4 fabric creating that great kind of star flower. Now this kit is called Totally Teal and I think it's fabulous. I had so much fun making this quilt, and with it being a 1 block, I was really able to get in the groove and get the blocks done. If you would like to see the other patterns from this book, be sure to watch the video that pops up. Happy quilting!